Hello, good evening, everyone. It's a really great pleasure and honor being here today. I come to Central and Eastern Europe quite regularly. I was yesterday in Moscow, but this is my very first visit to your country, Belarus, and to Minsk. And it's exciting to see so many people that are involved in high-tech ventures, young people that are developing the private sector, and thinking about the technologies of the future and how they're going to change the way we live and work and so on. So it's a great pleasure being able to present my views at this audience. Today I'd like to give you a bit of an outlook of how I see the future of the global economy, not in the short run, but more in the medium long term. What's going to happen to trade, to globalization, what's going to happen to technology. We've seen a recent backlash against trade, against globalization, even against big tech. Is it just temporary or something more fundamental that's going to change the world? And I usually go all over the world and I give speeches, and wherever I go, of course, people ask me to make forecasts about the global economy, both in the short term, the medium term, and long term. And whenever people ask me to make forecasts, I'm reminded of that famous quote by the general manager of the Yankee baseball team, Yogi Berra, who once said, it's very hard to make forecasts, especially about the future. So we have to be a little bit modest. There is also the joke that says that God created economists to make astrologers or weathermen look good when it comes to forecast. Most people, for example, in my profession, missed the global financial crisis. I was one of the few economists that saw it coming. And therefore, it's very hard to think about what's going to be happening to the future. But let me try to give you some perspective, at least, of some of the trends. And I think that one of the paradoxes of our time, and to me it's a bit of a paradox, that is in some dimension, our economic future today may be the best of all times, but unless we manage it correctly, both in the short term and the long term, it could become the worst of all times. Because if we're looking both at the short term and the cyclical stuff, there are some positive trends today in the global economy. And if we're looking medium, long-term trends having to do with globalization and technology, again, there is a potential for quite an exciting future, but there is also a significant number of downside risks. So I'm going to talk about what is the upside, what are the downside, and how we should manage them. And of course, that's relevant for any country, but also important for a small open economy like yours that is trying to grow faster by integrating itself in global supply chains and in the global economy. What are the upsides? What are the risks? Let me talk about some of the positive trends in the global economy. I'll start with the short term, and I'm going to talk later about medium long term. In the short run, what's good news about the global economy is that there is a pickup today in global growth after many years of anemic, subpar, mediocre economic growth. The IMF was calling it the new mediocre. The Chinese were calling it the new normal. Larry Summers was calling it the secular stagnation. Seems that now actually global growth is picking up. The IMF estimates that it's going to be closer to 4% on average this year. Stronger in emerging markets, weaker in advanced economies, but there is expansion. Positive growth is accelerating. And the other good news about this is that this is occurring at a time where inflation is still very low. So you have stronger growth, you still have low inflation, and therefore central banks like Federal Reserve or others can exit these unconventional monetary policies very slowly. And the combination of stronger growth, low inflation, easy monetary policy implies that until recently, until the last few months, investors were optimistic. Animal spirits were positive, risk was on, and risky assets like US and global equities, venture capital, private equity, valuations were going higher and higher in a positive feedback between the real economy and asset prices. So it looked like after many years of gloom and doom and depression and recessions and crises, there is both markets and economy that are becoming stronger, with few exceptions, but they're becoming, at least until recently. So that's a cyclical good news. The more secular good news in the global economy is based on many other factors as well. First of all, we had a global financial crisis, and this global financial crisis could have led to another global recession, but we did not have a global depression. We got out of this global recession, and the economies have been growing for the last few years. Asset market collapsed, and they've recovered for the last few years. The balance sheets and the profits of many corporations are strong, and if they become more optimistic about the future, they have the money to invest, to hire, to invest in new technology, to create more jobs, more firms, more innovation. The other important trend in the global economy is the rising role of emerging market economies. The typical advanced economy is aging, and therefore potential growth in US, in Europe, in Japan is between 1% and 2%, but the typical emerging market is growing 5% plus, led by Asia, China, and India, but also other parts of the world. And therefore, a larger share of global growth and global GDP in a few decades is going to come from emerging markets. Countries that are urbanizing, that are industrializing, with more demand for goods, for services, for infrastructure, for real estate, and so on and so on. So that's positive. The other positive about the global economy is that in spite of the recent backlash against globalization, if you think about it, for the last few decades, globalization has brought not millions, but billions of people out of poverty, out of the misery that they had. Look what was China or India, say, 30 or plus years ago. Look what was the state of the most republics in the Soviet Union before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the transition that was painful, but the transition now to more of a market economy, and incomes and welfare has been rising significantly. So globalization has been good, really, for billions of people, both in advanced economies and emerging markets. But maybe the most exciting thing about the medium-longer term trends in the global economy is that there are today a whole range of industries of the future. And these industries of the future are going to completely and radically change the way we live, the way we work, the way we play, the way we entertain ourselves, the way we live society, the way we interact. And there's a massive revolution. And these technologies, of course, are disruptive, and they are being introduced at a rate that is accelerating. Some people argue, actually, exponential growth. What are the industries of the future? I define them, one, as IT, information technologies, the combination of artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, and the Internet of Things is leading to a revolution in a variety of IT goods, services, and so on. The second one is, however, ET, energy technologies. It's not just new types of fossil fuels like shale gas and oil, but there is also a revolution in the alternative energy and the green economy. Solar power now is becoming cheaper than coal. Same thing for wind. There is clean tech. There is a future in which energy could become very cheap, because not only solar power can become very cheap, but now there are technology being built where the batteries are going to be able to store this energy. So every one of us in our homes can become a producer of energy and distribute it to the grid. So there may be a revolution in energy. It's going to lead to a collapse in the price of energy. There is BT, biotechnologies, all the research in biomedical research that's going to make us live much longer in life, in the 80s, 90s, even more so, and live healthier. Some people say that eventually humanity might even reach immortality once there is singularity. That might be too soon, but certainly a young person born today, healthy, in a middle-income country, his or her life expectancy is already expected to be close to 100 years, somebody born today. So a revolution in biotech. There is also 80, a revolution in agricultural technologies. Think of it this way. If the price of energy is going to collapse, then we're going to be able to resolve a problem that's becoming huge around the world, that is the lack of water. Because if you don't have water, you don't have food supply. And these days there are world tensions occurring around the world because of the lack of water. Because the low cost of energy is going to imply we can use essentially salt water, desalinize it very cheaply, and then provide for people, not just to drink, but also for agriculture. So there are new technologies in biotech that go in the agricultural field, and with cheap energy and cheap water, there could be a new agricultural revolution. There is TT, transportation technologies. It's only a matter of time. I don't know whether it's 5, 10, 15, or 20 years, where most transportation is going to be driverless. Driverless cars, driverless trucks, and maybe even goods and services are going to be provided by drones. You know, Amazon and others are starting to think about something like this. It's going to affect also the way we live, the idea of smart cities and transportation being completely different. Of course, there is also MT, manufacturing technologies, robotics, automation, 3D printing and manufacturing, personalized manufacturing. There'll be a complete revolution also in manufacturing. And unfortunately, also in a world in which there are geopolitical risks, there is also DT, or defense technologies, that is the application of high-tech to defense system, like we've seen it with drones or other high-tech weapon systems with one another, sort of another. And the future of armies and weapon system is going to be also very high-tech. And last but not least, there is also FT, that is financial technology, or the fintech revolution. And I would like to say a few more words about the fintech revolution, because it's something that is a topic that is quite hot today. And I'll make the following observation. While there is a lot of excitement today about blockchain, cryptocurrencies, crypto assets, Bitcoin, and so on, my view of it is actually that most of the revolution in financial technologies, and I believe very much in the future of fintech, is not going to be necessarily associated with blockchain. Because if you think of the most successful fintech firms today, what do? They combine on one side artificial intelligence and machine learning together with big data and together with sensors of various sorts, or the Internet of Things, to have a revolution in 4 things. 1, payment system. 2, credit allocation. 3, insurance services. And 4, asset management. Think of it this way. Everybody's talking about Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is not really a currency because it's not a unit of account, it's not a means of payment. But today, around the world, there are firms like Alipay or WeChat Pay in China, firms like PayPal or Venmo or Square in the United States, and so on around the world. And billions of people today around the world, billions of them, already using one or other one of these tools, essentially to make cheap payment system, domestically, online, across the world, and so on. And none of this system is based on blockchain. It's based on using artificial intelligence, big data, and other things, new and traditional technology, to provide faster and better payment system. It's going to change credit allocation. Today, a credit officer has to get all your information to decide whether to give you a loan or give you a mortgage and at which interest rate. Today, you can use the balance sheet, the P&L, the financial data, and the personal data of an individual. And there are firms in the UK and US that in 1 minute, when you apply online, they look at all of your data. In 60 seconds, they can provide you a loan at a certain interest rate, much more precisely than any credit or loan officers. So again, it's using big data and machine learning. Same thing with insurance. We can use all our information, all our data to provide insurance services, knowing what is the individual risk of each individual, of each firm, and so on. And of course, there is now an ongoing revolution also in asset management. Robo-advisors, algorithmic trading, using of quantitative approaches. And once AI becomes more sophisticated, we can see how trading decisions are going to be done by AI, machine learning, rather than by your traditional portfolio investment manager. The point is that whether you're looking at payment system or credit allocation or insurance or asset management, there are now hundreds and thousands of firms in this space, in US, in Europe, in Japan, in China, in emerging markets. And all these are combination, as I pointed out, of machine learning, big data, and Internet of Things They're not things that are based on blockchain or cryptocurrency. The point being, there's a little bit of a fad, in my view. There is too much of an overhype about blockchain or cryptocurrency. The big revolution in financial services and banking has to do with new technology. It's very high tech, but it's not necessarily blockchain related. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind. So if we think about all this innovation in the world, as I pointed out, we forget that our welfare of individuals on average around the world, advanced economies and emerging markets, has improved in a huge amount in the last few decades. We complain, of course, about economic problems, political problems, financial crisis, but if you're looking at the trend for humanity, humanity is actually much better off today than it was 30, 50, 70, 100 years ago. Think of it this way, and I'm referring to observation made by an historian, Yuval Harari, who wrote that book, Sapiens, about the history of Homo sapiens and humanity. We live today in a world in which there is no longer war among major powers. Highly unlikely the major power is going to have war. Today there are more people who die of suicide than they are killed in all wars and in terrorism. Today we live in a world in which we have conquered hunger and starvation that used to kill millions of people. Today there are more people who die of being obese, too fat, as opposed to dying from hunger, starvation, or famine. We live in a world in which there are no major plagues, diseases, infectious diseases that used to be like the plague killing millions of people. Today there are more people that die of old age than from all the plagues and infectious diseases in the world. So if you think of it this way, you think how much actually the welfare of humanity, both in advanced economies and emerging market, has improved in the last few decades. And if you take this longer-term perspective, things are not as bad as some of the short-run volatility makes it. Now, this is the good news. But let's think about the things that can go wrong about this picture about the global economy. For the last 2 years, financial markets were doing very well. US and global equities from the spring of 2016 until February of this year were going higher and higher. US was doing better, Europe, Japan, China, emerging markets. Even the country that had a recession in the last couple of years, like Russia or Brazil, were getting out of that recession, and their financial markets were doing well. But in the last 3 months, there have been two major cases of volatility in financial markets, what people call risk-off episodes, where suddenly investors become pessimistic as opposed to optimistic in the future. The first episode occurred in February of this year, when there were worries about maybe suddenly inflation in the US getting out of control and forcing the US central banks, the Fed, to hike much more, causing a tightening of financial conditions that could slow down US and global growth. So in February, when there was a 10% correction in US and global equity, the fear was, is inflation coming back after many years when we're worrying about deflation? And the second kind of episode occurred in March and April of this year. And the second episode of risk-off is a bit deeper, has to do with longer-term issue. One was the increasing worry among investors about the risk of trade wars, not just between US and China, but also between US and Russia, US and other parts of the world. Not just a trade war on goods, but also potential restriction to foreign direct investment, capital flows, and technology. And the second leg of that risk-off episode was a correction of technology stocks, the Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google of the world in the US and others around the world, because of some concerns about privacy, as this trouble with Facebook showed, and a broad backlash against big tech. And I'll talk about why there may be a backlash against big tech. So let's think about this more fundamental problem, the risk of protectionism and backlash against globalization, and the risk of even a backlash against big tech and against technology. Let's see whether this is a serious problem and what will be the eventual impacts of it. First point I'll make on protectionism and trade war is that these are tensions that are a proxy from a much broader populist backlash against one, globalization, two, against trade, three, against migration, four, against supranational authorities like the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, the WTO, and five, even the beginning of a backlash against technology and technological innovation. What has happened in the last few decades has been that in spite of lots of growth and globalization, there's been a significant rise in income and wealth inequality, both in advanced economies and emerging markets. This rise in inequality is driven by many factors. Some of it is trade and globalization. Some of it is migration and migrant worker working for less than your local worker. Some of it is that technological innovation today is becoming increasingly capital intensive, skill bias, and labor saving. So if you are an owner of capital, financial and real, you do well. If you are a highly skilled worker or entrepreneur and you have good human capital, you succeed with trade and globalization and technology. But if you're a low-skilled, blue-collar worker in the United States in traditional low-value added industries, your jobs and income are being threatened by technology as much as globalization. So there are many reasons why income inequality has been rising together with these trends and so on. So one thing that I think that we fail to recognize as economists is that while trade and globalization is good, it increases the economic pie, the distribution of that pie can be unequal. Trade and globalization leads to winners and losers. Some people go ahead and some people are left behind because they don't have the skills, the education, the technology to succeed in a globalized digital world. If you own capital in advanced economies and emerging markets, technology and globalization is good for you. If you're a skilled labor worker, you're doing well. If you're even an unskilled worker or medium-skilled worker in emerging markets, you benefit from globalization. But there are also losers in advanced economies. Those are our low-skilled workers in manufacturing, but because of technological innovation, even medium-skilled workers, blue collars, and even white collars are now being threatened by trade, globalization, and technology. And the reality is that for a while, the losers were quiet, and the elites were telling them, don't worry, we're going to help you, we're going to compensate you, we're going to give you skills and education, you're going to survive and thrive. They were left behind, and now there is a populist backlash against globalization. This populist backlash, you see it in advanced economies, the election of Trump in the United States, the Brexit vote in the UK, the rise of extreme right-wing or left-wing populist parties in the Eurozone and in EU, but even in emerging markets that all in all have benefited from globalization, there is a trend of economic nationalism, and there is a trend against liberal democracy. You have a string of nationalist strongmen that are becoming more popular in a bunch of emerging markets. Economies, look at Putin in Russia, or Erdogan in Turkey, or Orban in Hungary, or Kaczynski in Poland, or Duterte in the Philippines, or Maduro in Venezuela, or even President Xi Jinping that just decided to potentially to be president for life and is becoming increasingly authoritarian. So liberal democracy actually today is challenged, and this is one of the aspects of this economic and political entrenchment and nationalism and populist backlash that you have to think about it. But one of the paradoxes I think they have to keep in mind is the following one. Today in the US and Europe and many other parts of the world, people are panicking about trade. Trump says Chinese are stealing US jobs by dumping their goods in the United States, or cheap worker from Mexico, Latin America is stealing the jobs of workers in the United States. But the reality is that in the future, more than trade and more than migration, the biggest disruption to jobs and to income is not going to come from trade and migration, but it's going to come actually by disruptive new technologies in the industries of the future. And I'll give you the following example. Suppose that Donald Trump was able to impose a 50% tariff on all goods coming US. So you don't import anything, you have to produce at home. And suppose he was building a big wall all over the United States that nobody can get into the United States. So there is no net migration. If you think about it, in the next 10, 20 years, the biggest disruption to jobs is not going to come from trade or migration, but technology. Because in the United States, think of it this way, eventually we're going to have driverless cars and trucks. It's just a matter of time. And in 48 out of 50 states in the United States, the #1 job is truck drivers. And the #2 job is all these Uber and other drivers that are driving people around. And eventually, once we have driverless cars and trucks, all these jobs of truckers and all the jobs of the Uber and related driver are going to be gone. So even if there was no trade, even if there was no migration, technology is going to disrupt jobs. And it's going to disrupt jobs not just in transportation, not just in manufacturing, where the factory of the future is going to be what? A bunch of robots and 2 people. One manning all those machines and robots, another person sweeping the floor, and even the guy who's sweeping the floor is going to be replaced by one of these Roomba robots who can clean the floor faster and sooner and don't take bathroom break. So even that job is going to be gone. It's going to be automated by a robot. So that's the factory of the future. But more importantly, many service jobs in transportation, in government, in education, in financial services are going to also be replaced by AI, robots, automation, and machine. Now, there's a big debate, of course, today on whether AI, robotic, and automation is going to lead us to a utopian future where everything is going to be great or a dystopian future. Those who believe in the utopian future say, don't worry, because all this technology reduces the price of all goods and services, so everything is going to become cheaper, and the purchasing power of every individual on lots of goods is going to become higher. Say, the price of technology, laptops, tablets, phones has dropped in real terms sharply. And today, a smartphone is faster than a supercomputer 30 years ago. So that's one of the benefits of this innovation. So one view says, don't worry, everything becomes cheaper and we're going to have lots of purchasing power, and there'll be lots of new industries of the future that are going to create lots of new jobs that we don't even know of. So there is no risk about jobs. The more dystopian future instead says many jobs will be gone, not just in manufacturing, but also in services, and increasingly they're not going to be replaced by new jobs. For every job that is created, say, by Amazon in the United States, there are 10 retail jobs in stores that are disappearing today in the United States. So there is something radically different. And not only there's not going to be jobs in the future for most people, but the distribution of the benefits is going to be very unequal. If you have capital, if you're a skilled labor, if you are an entrepreneur, if you have good human capital, like most of you in this crowd, you'll do well. But if you're a low skill or medium skill, white collar or blue collar, you might be swept by technology. So is the future utopian or is the future dystopian? The honest answer, we don't know. However, the recent backlash against big tech has, I think, at least 5 dimensions to it. The first one, of course, is the impact of AI eventually on jobs and labor and income. Dystopian or utopian, that's only one dimension of it. But the second dimension of it that has become to the fore in the last few weeks in the US, but not just in the US, but also in Europe, is the dimension of the privacy. This Facebook scandal, where essentially 87 million personal data were, unquote, stolen and used for political purposes, was an alarm bell. In Europe, they're now pushing for new legislation that's going to provide much more stronger privacy to individuals. There was a recent cover of The Economist magazine called AI Spy, or the role of AI in the workplace, saying that your boss is watching you and everything you do as a worker is being monitored. So it's one form of control. And of course, there is a bigger worry that the combination of AI, big data, is going to lead to a big brother society where authoritarian regimes are going to be controlling the freedom of their own individuals. Look what's happening, for example, in China, where you have a credit social rating system based on tracking what people do. Today in China, face recognition technology is so advanced that if you jaywalk and cross the street with a red light, they recognize your face, they know who you are, and they send you a fine in the mail to pay for jaywalking and crossing on a red light. This is the kind of stuff that is happening, and more of this stuff is happening. So people are starting to worry about privacy. Maybe not in China, where you have a very authoritarian regime, but in the US and Europe, privacy is going to be a big issue, and part of the backlash against the technologies, do we have any privacy left? A third dimension of this backlash against big tech has to do with the potential market power of these big tech firms that reduce competition. People say eventually Amazon is going to become the only retailer, swallowing up all the traditional retailer. It's going to become an oligopoly, if not a monopoly. There's not going to be enough competition. So people are saying, should we break up Google, Facebook, Amazon, or should we regulate them? That's an ongoing debate that's going to continue. The fourth dimension of this backlash is the issue of taxation. People say these firms make tons of profits, but they can transfer these profits to low-tax jurisdiction. They don't pay much taxes. And when you buy goods online, you don't pay sales taxes, and therefore governments are strapped for revenue, and there is a social problem involved in it. That's also a backlash. And the final dimension of this backlash is the worry about the safety of AI. Recently in the US, as you know, there were two traffic accidents with these AI cars. They were driverless, one Tesla and one Uber. People got killed. One person got killed in each one of these accidents, and now people say, oh my God, these things may be dangerous rather than safe. And people then say, what's going to happen to a future when eventually the robots are fully autonomous? Are they going to be safe for us? Are they going to work for us? Or they're going to eventually revolt against us? A Blade Runner types of kind of a concern. So this is not just an issue about jobs. It's not just about privacy. It's also about market power, about taxation, about the safety of this thing. So if we think then about the future of globalization, in some ways what's globalization is more trade in goods, more trade in services, more trade in capital, international mobility of capital, more trade in labor, migration of labor, more trade in news, data, information across borders, and more trade in technology that is being transferred one country to another. These are all the dimensions of globalization. Today, the backlash against globalization is in two of these elements, trade in goods and trade in labor. People say we don't want foreign goods that are going to steal our jobs, and we don't want foreign workers to come and steal our jobs coming in our country. So you already see in the US protectionism on goods and then restriction to migration. My fear, however, is that the next leg of this backlash against globalization is going to be against trade in services that are becoming tradable, trade in capital and capital mobility, control on international transfers of news, data, information, and also to the international transfer of technology. Now let me elaborate on why I think these are potential threats that you have to think about and consider as potential restriction to technological innovation and globalization. The first point I'll make here is that the backlash against globalization and trade and against big tech is not just because Donald Trump was elected by a bunch of blue-collar workers and he wants to protect their jobs and their income. There is a more broader political and geopolitical dimension to this risk of a trade war. Today in the US, you hear people, hawks, that are essentially accusing China of trying to steal the industries of the future of the US. As you know, China has this plan, Made in China 2025, where they say in the next 15 years, we want to achieve leadership in AI, in robotic, in high tech, in biotech, in aerospace, and all the 10 top industries of the future. And the new national security strategy of the US says if China is able to steal our technology and be leader in this technology and firms and industries of the future, this is going to be not just a threat to our economic security, but it's going to be also a threat to our own national security. There is definitely right now a rising strategic rivalry between a rising power like China that has greater economic, trading, financial power, but increasingly also political, military and geopolitical, and existing power like the United States. And this rivalry is going to get worse. And it's going to get worse because one element of technology that I think is important that creates this tension is the question of cyber warfare. And cyber warfare is important not only in the dimension of security, stealing your weapon system or figuring out where your weapons and your military assets are. That's the more military dimension. But there is another dimension I think is very important. Cyber today can be used to steal data and steal technology of your rival and adversary. And that's a problem, politically and socially. And also cyber increasingly could be used to damage critical infrastructure of a country, especially if you rely on foreign technologies. This is why, if you are looking at the news in the last few days, you have seen that both US and China are restricting now each other tech firms' FDI into each other's market. The US has just said some Chinese firms cannot buy US tech firms and vice versa. And now it's getting to the point of saying you cannot even use our own component, like this tension between US and this Chinese firm, ZTE. Another example of it, of course, is what has happened with the recent US sanctions on Russia. Today, these are financial sanctions that are causing economic and financial damage to Russia. But I was just yesterday in Moscow and speaking with government officials, and some people said, well, if we're going to use US technology, what prevents the US one day to impose sanctions that completely damage our own critical infrastructure, because everything is based on computers and microchips and so on. So maybe we have just to source nationally this stuff rather than buy them from Intel, Cisco, or you name it, because tomorrow is not going to be financial warfare, it might be cyber warfare. The point is that this is a tension between US and China, US and Russia, but we risk to end up in a world in the future where, paradoxically, in spite of technology being global, there could be a complete balkanization of the internet and of technology. You'll have areas of the world like the US, Europe, and the West using one set of technology, Russia and his own kind of area using another set of technology, and China using another one. We could have separate internets, separate tech firms and national champions that each one of these regions is trying to grow, separate software and hardware that is not compatible with each other. Because these are things that have a geopolitical and security dimension to it. And the risk is actually that we're not going to integrate more. We might be disintegrating, and we'll have more balkanization of these things. So let me conclude now with the following observation that I think are relevant for a small open economy like yours that, as the sign says, wants to become the high-tech nation. You know, I go every year to Israel where I have friends and family, and as you know, there's that book calling Israel the startup nation. I see that you want to become the high-tech nation, and this crowd here of innovators and entrepreneurs shows how much there is an ambition and actually drive to become successful. And I think that the lesson actually of the last few decades has been that small open economies, they integrate themselves in the global economy. They become more open to trade, to capital mobility, to technology, and so on, tend to increase their growth and their standard of living. So there is certainly a positive story. Small open economies benefit from globalization and the spread of technologies. They benefit both as consumers. Even if you don't innovate, having a cheap smartphone that you buy from US or China makes you more productive. But you also benefit as producer, because with the new global supply chain and the fact that services are becoming now traded, They used to be non-tradable, but now all sorts of services, starting with IT services, are tradable. This small open economy can become part of these global supply chains that creates goods and services. Increasingly, as we know, there's a significant outsourcing and offshoring of, for example, IT services, and therefore countries like yours, or Israel, or Philippines, or India, that have the skills in IT can benefit from this global supply chain by innovating, being part of it, and creating goods and services. So the story is one in which, of course, the private sector has to grow, has to become a larger part of the economy, is going to be a source of productivity growth, and opening up rather than closing up, being outward rather than inward, being open to trade, to technology, to foreign direct investment is the path in the future for any small open economy, especially one that invests into education, the human capital, and the skills to make sure that everybody can survive and thrive in a globalized and a digital economy. However, final observation, as I pointed out, there is a backlash. There is backlash against trade, there is backlash against globalization, and there is even a backlash against technology. So I do fear that there are social, economic, and political forces that may restrict trade in goods, trade in services, trade in data, trade in technology, trade in labor, trade in capital. We're to keep the global economy open, but certainly we have also to be aware of these other trends that can lead us to a deglobalization rather than a globalization, and a world in which technology is balkanized rather than becoming shared in a positive way globally. So that's one important point to keep in mind. I'll thank you very much for your attention. I think we're going to have a little bit of a discussion, a Q&A right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roubini. Thank you very much for coming to Minsk, for joining our forum. I know that you refer to yourself as a global nomad. You travel a lot, and it's your first time in Minsk. Please take a seat. We have some questions.
Okay.
In
the middle? Okay.
In the center, we have some questions with Pavel to you, because you have covered a lot of issues during your speech, but we have several questions. First of all, I wonder, how can we increase the number of entrepreneurs and inventors in society? Because I know your point that not everybody can be the entrepreneur or inventor, but the society should to increase the number of them. How?
Well, I would say that entrepreneurship has to do with having a dynamic, competitive, and innovative private sector, and therefore the broad policy will be of having, first of all, a set of economic policy that increases over time the share of the economy that comes from the private sector that usually tends to have higher productivity growth and innovation than the public sector. As you know, even your country has a legacy still where at least 2/3, some people say 3/4 of the economy might be still public and state-owned enterprises. That might be the bad news. The good news is that there is now a dynamic private sector, especially in IT and other things. And I think that the wisest thing is to have a set of changes in regulation and policies and law that make, first of all, the ease of doing business much lower, because, as we know, in many countries there is red tape, bureaucracy to open and run and tax a business. And two, that having also a legal framework that incentivizes creating firms and startups and make sure that they get funding and financing and they can be successful. So that will be the set of overall policies that is important and necessary to have a dynamic private sector and, of course, technologically innovative sector as well.
I don't believe we can stop technological trends. I mean, technological trends, exponential growth, there is a way to slow it down a little bit, but there is no way to stop it, and it will go fast. At the same time, if you look at a country's educational system, people, they're not changing so quickly, right? So most likely technologies will affect jobs, etc. What are the countries in the world who you believe are doing a better job in preparing their countries overall for next time, for next normal?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with you that eventually you cannot stop technology, even if the backlash for a while can slow down the rate of adoption and change in many and different dimensions. The thing what you do about it, some people are totally optimistic and say, let's not worry, we'll all be richer, there's not going to be rising inequality, and there'll be lots of new jobs and industries we don't even think about. I think that the reality is more complicated. There'll be massive disruption, entire firms, jobs, professional category, and industry is going to decline and disappear while others are going to be emerging. So the question is how you react to it and who's doing it. The first best solution will be, as I pointed out, to provide to every young person, also worker, the skills, the human capital, the necessary education that allows you to survive and thrive in a global and digital economy. It's easier said than done. We have to change maybe our education system to make sure there are more people that go into what's referred as STEM, science, technology, engineering, and computing and mathematics. That's one solution. Things that foster entrepreneurship are positive. Yes, not everybody can become an entrepreneur, but the entrepreneurs are going to create firms that are going to be creating some new jobs. And in most countries, small and medium-sized enterprises tend to be the most important creators, actually, of jobs. And then if we do all these things, and unfortunately, some people are going to be left behind, they're not going to be able to adapt, then I think that if the economic pie is going to become larger, and then there's a question of unequal distribution. Some people have bad luck, some people have better luck or skills. Then you have to make sure that you don't get social and political instability, and the margin taxing those who are winners, skilled labor and capital, and redistributing to those who are losers might be the right thing to do. And one variant of this idea, of course, is the idea of some variant of universal basic income. We're not yet there, but if this disruption will become persistent, I think that eventually countries are going to start to think along those lines. There are a bunch of other ideas. There is no solution. No one has resolved this problem. Some countries are thinking more deeply about it, like some of the countries in Northern Europe, Norway, Finland, Denmark, and others. It's an open question.
Related question, productivity will rise even faster in the next 20 years than it was rising before. So theoretically, we should work less. Using our own example, I don't see it. I mean, I work more and more every year.
Yeah.
Right? Although I also think I'm more productive, but I still kind of working. So what's the future? I mean, how do you deal with that? Because there is a,
is it vicious
limited
circle?
capacity.
Well, there was this view that John Maynard Keynes, the great economist, in the 30s, when at that time there was the second industrial revolution, he said, eventually, if there is more output and we need less work, no problem. Instead, all of us working 60 hours a week or 50 or 40 or 5 days a week, we're going to work only 10 or 20 hours and 3 days a week, and the rest of the time we'll enjoy the leisure, having friends, family, writing poetry, becoming artists, and so on. So this was the more ideal view of what could happen, where everybody is better off. But as you pointed out about your observation, you work probably 6 days a week. I travel 7 days a week, and I'm sure many of you entrepreneurs and anybody like myself and you who have had a business knows that it's like 24/7. You work 100 hours a week or even longer. The reality is that technological innovation is going to be such that those that have the skills and the human capital and entrepreneurship are not going to work 10 or 20 hours. They're going to still work 100 hours because they have creative ideas and business idea and they want to succeed and grow these businesses, and they're going to work like dogs, like we all do. And then those who don't have any skills and they cannot acquire them are going to be without income and without jobs. So it's going to be a dichotomous workforce where the winners actually work like before or even more so because they're very productive, and those who are unproductive, the machines are going to replace them, and that's going to create even more social tension. And it's going to create also more even social tension for the following reason. Some people say, don't worry, if people really don't have jobs, I'm going to give them a check for life, universal basic income. But those voters, say in the US, blue collars who are feeling the threat of trade, globalization, migration, technology, who voted for Donald Trump, they don't want a welfare. They say, what gives me dignity in life is having a job and having work so that I can go to my family, my children, my spouse, and have a job. Without a job and having a check from the government, there is no reason to live. And therefore, that solution of just saying, keep people on the welfare dole forever, and that's going to be a solution, may not work because people want to be productive in one way or another. They want just to sit and watch movies or play video games all day long, even if there is a subset of society in the United States that is in front of TV or playing video games all day long. But these people are also very socially and mentally and politically very disaffected. So it's a difficult problem, and I'm not sure what is the solution. I don't have a simple one.
You mentioned about a number of controversial trends in terms of technology development, in terms of social consequences. Are you personally optimistic or pessimistic about all these trends?
Well, I'm optimistic in the sense that, I believe that technology, while being disruptive, is going to increase significantly productivity and productivity growth and the economic pie. The interesting thing is that while there is all this technological innovation, we don't see it in the macro data. Productivity growth actually has not been very fast. It's been very slow, even in the US, and there is a paradox of why. Some people say we're not measuring properly all these free goods and services we get from smartphone and apps and so on. Some people say, no, it's a matter of time until B2B and B2C technological innovation spread and increase productivity, like during the first internet revolution, where it took time until the productivity growth started in the tech sector and then led to the economy. So there's more optimistic view that says it's just a matter of time, but we don't see it, in the economic data. The problem is not going to be that the economic pie is not going to expand. It's going to expand, but then the issue is going to be one of distribution of this benefit. As I said, if most of the gains go to owners of capital and skilled labor, then everybody else is left behind, and that's going to lead to this populist backlash. So that's the issue we have to address. But I'm among those people who are a technological optimist in terms of this is being real. I spoke about all these industries of the future. I don't know which one of them is going to be most successful, but all of them are essentially a variant of AI, big data, IoT, and you name it. So I believe that we'll see the benefits, but I'm worried about the distribution of those benefits.
And there are a lot of top managers and entrepreneurs in this audience who represent different industries such as retail, banking, real estate, manufacturing and production. And what's your advice for them if we take into consideration digitalization of different industries? What can you advise them to do now?
Well, my general advice will be that each one of these industries, and pretty much any industry, including, I would say, even things more traditional like real estate, can be disrupted by technology. Certainly manufacturing is going to be disrupted by technology with robotic and automation, and it's true that countries that have lower wages are going to be slower in adopting machines and robots than countries that have higher wages. But, the trend is going to be that eventually, robots are being now used even in parts of India, not just in advanced economies. So it's going to be first in manufacturing. Secondly, as I said, it's going to be in a whole variety of financial services. So any firm has to be gradually adopting these new innovations to make sure that they're not left behind by the new online bank or online payment system and whatever, even if, of course, the speed of adoption of some of this technology can differ across countries because of institutional, legal, and historical restrictions. There'll be radical changes, of course, in retail, where, eventually people say the traditional store may gradually disappear, and most of the purchases are going to be done online, and eventually, if it's not a truck, a drone is going to get you the goods you're buying. And of course, services can already be bought online. But I would say, even a sector like, real estate, say, I don't know how it's here in this country, but in the US, you have the whole intermediation chain of getting the title, getting a mortgage, assessment of your home, the insurance of it. There are millions of people that are involved in these, real estate agents and brokers. Say you buy a home, you have to pay 6% to a broker. I'm sure there'll be eventually a disruptive online broker that doesn't charge 6%, but 3 or 2. There'll be more competition so that you can bypass the broker and find the properties online, to give an example. So you have to think about the disruptions and being one step ahead of the curve. Some of these changes are not going to happen overnight, but if you're sitting on a traditional incumbency and you don't see the technological changes coming, you might be disrupted faster than you know. So you have to look ahead.
Can you share your thoughts on education from two perspectives? How education should change? And for us, as many of us are parents, my son will be entering college market in a few years. So decision and solution is not so obvious to me right now than it was like probably 20 years ago.
There are many important dimensions of it. And one question is, suppose you have a son or a daughter and they have to college now, what would you suggest to them to study? Of course, they have to follow their passion, but they should also have some sense of what are going to be the jobs of the future. And here I think there are two extreme views, and I'm not sure which one is correct in terms of type of education. Some people say, listen, unless your major in college or university is something to do with STEM, science, technology, engineering, computer science, mathematics, because some variants of these things are going to be the future of most jobs. Unless you study this stuff, if you go into traditional literature and humanities, you're not going to have the skills for the future. That's one view. The other view says, no, in the future, any one of your children will never have any more lifetime job in a secure, either private or public sector firm. You'll have to change not only jobs every few years, but maybe completely job profession and industries, because there'll be so many disruptions that you have to adapt yourself. And maybe somebody who has a general liberal arts education, humanities, who can read well, write well, think well, critically, who has a flexible mind, maybe the right types of skills for these disruptions are going to be occurring. And I honestly don't know whether one type of education or the other type of education is the right one. Maybe if I had to hedge my risk, I would say take a major in STEM and take a minor in humanities or poetry, just to have a little bit of exposure to both. That's one dimension. The second dimension is that, as I pointed out, there is the potential for online technology also to disrupt in the future, the way we also educate people. I mean, today there are in the United States, I don't know, maybe 10,000 professors of economics like me who teach in colleges and university courses on economics. But why do you need 10,000 of them? Suppose you take the top 100 and you create a top course on macro or micro or international or whatever field, and you make it available for free at low cost for everybody, then everybody could, even in a small rural town, take a course provided by a professor at Harvard or MIT or Moscow State University or whatever are good universities around the world. And therefore, maybe the way we also teach is going to change. I mean, take poor countries of the world like rural Africa or rural India. The problem with traditional education is it takes a lot of money to build a school, brick and mortar, literally physical infrastructure. Then these teachers are not very skilled. They're not very well prepared. They're not having the most advanced learning techniques and knowledge. They're not paid very much. So half of the time they don't even show to class, the teachers, because they have a second job and they do something else. So there is significant absenteeism. And then the students are those who get very poor education. What is the world in which we have little tablets that cost very little, that are powered by solar energy, and you have the most advanced Khan Academy or Coursera or whatever courses available, and maybe this is the way children should be learning more. I'm not saying replacing altogether the traditional teacher, but maybe, again, using technology to leverage the way we learn, and so on and so on. I don't think there is a simple answer to this question, but yeah, even in education and the way we teach is going to change. And maybe it's not just a question of going 10, 12 years K2 to study and then 4 years of university. You'll have to learn and retrain yourself all your life because technology and disruption is going to occur. So learning is going to be a lifetime kind of process as opposed to limited one period of your time. So we have to really rethink everything, including education and the way we teach and how we teach it.
I'd like to go back to the issue of distribution and to the issue of imbalances in the global economy in spite of increasing productivity. Do you believe that artificial intelligence may calculate and to find the right balance between production and distribution to solve this problem generally?
Well, I don't think that the artificial intelligence can replace policymakers, and people will have to make at some level decisions about the trade-off between one side economic efficiency and on the other side economic equality. Because if you want to go to efficiency, you'd say only the most productive people who have the skills are going to benefit and use the new technology, and actually new technology are going to make them more efficient, more productive, but then everybody else is going to be left behind. And if you go, of course, in a society where you emphasize only redistribution and equality, if the pie is small, everybody's poor, like in some poor African countries. So in economics, there's always a debate on how much you want to maximize efficiency as opposed to maintain equality, and usually there is some trade-off between the two. But those are decisions that, unless you believe the AI becomes the benevolent God who knows better than all of us what is the right allocation of resources, those are eminently political, social, and moral decisions that eventually us as a society will have to make those decisions. I hope we're not going to delegate those decisions to a machine. That will be a sad day, frankly. We have to decide certain things on our own and have a control on those decisions as human beings and as societies.
Belarus is a small country. The only way for us to grow is to be export-oriented. We need to serve some other markets. Traditionally, this country economy is mainly focused on Russia. Russia depends on oil and gas, and I guess you also do not have too optimistic view about oil and gas market. I mean, oil and gas prices. Most likely, in a 10, 15 years, there will be overall downwards trend. So what's your view on Russia position? Forget about politics. I'm not talking about politics, but economy. And if you were in Belarusian shoes, would you bet your market on Russia, or would you turn your attention to somewhere else?
Well, I go to Russia regularly, and even in Russia, leaving aside the most recent sanction, potential growth in Russia was and is 1.5%, but not because there are sanctions. Even 3 years ago, because before the sanction, productivity growth is very low, and everybody, even the government, admits that they have to do structural reforms to increase private sector, entrepreneurship, innovation, labor productivity, and so on. And unless they do this reform, they're going to be stuck with a 1.5% growth. So the problem with Russia today is not sanction, is that are you going to do the reforms that go against entrenched interests, lobby, powerful groups of oligarchs and others, bureaucrats who are elites to benefit from the current system that benefits them, but the average person, the middle class, is not doing well. And I don't have a simple answer. It's a complicated political economy, but they themselves realize that they have to diversify. They cannot rely only on oil, energy, raw material. They have to diversify production, diversify exports. I mean, of course, it's easier said than done, And I think the lesson also for yourselves is that your economic model in the long term cannot be only exports and economic interaction with Russia and relying on either cheap inputs from Russia or using them to reprocess them or export stuff and so on. They have to first have a greater role of the private sector and the innovative private sector, and eventually create goods and services, export to Europe and the rest of the world. But let me put it this way: some people believe that actually countries that have natural resources, like Russia and others, benefit from, of course, having high demand for oil, energy, natural resources. But the history of the last few decades is that countries that actually have natural resources, they're suffering of what is called the resource curse. Because when you have lots of resources and the price is high, you become lazy because you can dig a hole in the ground, pump stuff out, sell it, and then distribute to everybody some of these rents, and therefore there's no incentive to innovate. While when you don't have natural resources, actually, you have to actually invest into something else in order to become successful. And think about countries like Israel, like Singapore, like Hong Kong, like Korea, like Japan, some smaller, some bigger. These are all countries that have almost zero natural resources, and their economic success, they become among the most innovative, technologically advanced, high income, and so on countries in the world. They came because since they didn't have natural resources, they had to invest into their own people, into education, into skills, into human capital, into innovation, and they were therefore successful this way. So, the good news is that if you don't have natural resources, and if eventually natural resources of Russia are not going to be there, that's good for you because it gives an incentive to say, I cannot depend on that stuff, I have to depend on myself. And of all forms of capital, physical, infrastructure, financial, institutional, the biggest driver of long-term economic growth is human capital. It means your people, their minds, their education, their skills, their entrepreneurship, their innovation. That's a driver of growth. So who cares whether there are natural resources or not? The future are in people and what they do with their lives and their jobs and their ideas and their creations.
And all these things are very relevant to Belarus now and are very relevant to our agenda that we are discussing at High Tech Nation Forum. Mr. Roubini, thank you very much for your coming. Tomorrow, one question from Pavel, and tomorrow we will continue discussing the future with Raymond Kurzweil. We will discuss singularity, we will discuss immortality as well, but now we are just Homo sapiens, and we are limited in terms of time, but Pavel has one more question.
In 2006, you predicted 2008 crisis, right? Right now, some people in the US say the country is on the verge of a civil war. I mean, probably, hopefully not a real civil war, but country is divided, clearly divided. Next crisis, will it be financial crisis? Will it be social crisis? Will it be a revolution? Will it be a war? What do you think about that?
And when we can face it?
Well, I don't expect for the time being a financial crisis. I don't expect that in advanced economies there'll be revolution or war or things of this sort, because when problems occur, benevolent people who understand the problem try to find solutions, and the solutions tend to be pragmatic ones in mixed economies where there is private and public sector. But it's true that not just in the United States, but I see what is happening in the UK, what's happening in Western Europe, what's happening in Hungary or Turkey or Poland and many other parts of the world. There is a bit of a disaffection against the establishment. There is disaffection against politics as usual. There is variants of populism. There is a backlash against liberal democracy, and the trends of trade, globalization, migration and even technology, even more so technology in the future, are creating disruptions in people's incomes, life, and not just lives, but also their culture, their beliefs, their sovereignty, and so on. So I fear that that's going to create variants of social and political instability. Not revolution, not wars, not financial meltdowns, but these are things that either we address, because you cannot have a world in which there's a group of people, the top 25%, who are the winners, and most of the rest are left behind, because the left behind eventually either vote or demonstrate or they take action to say, enough of this, and I want also to be able to succeed, or you have to pay me something. So in every society, I think we have to think about these dislocations and how we address by giving a hope that other people be able also to be winner and not to be left behind. And there are different ways of doing it, but unless we address it, you'll have a problem like this, not just in the US, but in 5-10 years from now, you're going to have it also in Russia. You know, for a country that is middle income growing 1-2% per year, today it's fine, but 5-10 years from now, the young people are going to say, this is not the future I want for myself. They don't want it, Americans don't want it, Belarusians don't want it. They want a life of progress, of innovation, of improving your lot and having a better future for yourself, for your family, and for your children. So we have to be aware of it, because if we're not to be aware of it, there'll be a meaningful backlash everywhere around the world.
Thank you very much. And at the end of our conversation, I would appreciate if you say some words of encouragement to our audience, to our entrepreneurs, to our top managers, people who live in Belarus, who run business in Belarus, and who wish to be successful on internal market and on global market as well.
And I wish you very well. So I'm very impressed by the vitality and dynamism of a young group of entrepreneurs in general in the IT sector. And I do hope that you're going to become the high-tech nation. Why not? You have to have an open vision, and certainly many of you have it here.
Thank you very much.